wagons, the huge beetles of great guns, crawling under the poplars, along the dikes and roads northward, along ways lined by the neutral, unmolested, ambiguously observant Dutch. All the barges and shipping upon the canals had been requisitioned for transport. In that clear, bright, warm weather, it would all have looked from above like some extravagant festival of animated toys. As the sun sank westward, the spectacle must have become a little indistinct because of a golden haze. Everything must have become warmer and more glowing, and because of the lengthening of the shadows more manifestly in relief. The shadows of the tall churches grew longer and longer, until they touched the horizon and mingled in the universal shadow, and then, slow and soft, and wrapping the world in fold after fold of deepening blue, came the night at first obscurely simple, and then with faint points here and there, and then jeweled in darkening splendor with 100,000 lights. Out of that mingling of darkness and ambiguous glares, the noise of an unceasing activity would have arisen, the louder and plainer now because there was no longer any distraction of sight. It may be that watcher drifting in the pellucid gulf beneath the stars watched all through the night. It may be that he dozed. But if he gave way to so natural a proclivity, assuredly on the fourth night of the great flank march he was aroused, for that was the night of the battle in the air that decided the fate of Holland. The aeroplanes were fighting at last, and suddenly about him, above and below, with cries and uproar rushing out of the four quarters of heaven, striking, plunging, oversetting, soaring to the zenith and dropping to the ground, they came to assail or defend the myriads below. Secretly, the Central European power had gathered his flying machines together, and now he threw them as a giant might fling a handful of 10,000 knives over the low country. And amidst that swarming flight were 5 that drove headlong for the sea walls of Holland, carrying atomic bombs. From north and west and south, the Allied aeroplanes rose in response and swept down upon this sudden attack. So it was that war in the air began. Men rode upon the whirlwind that night and slew and fell like archangels. The sky rained heroes upon the astonished earth. Surely the last fights of mankind were the best. What was the heavy pounding of your Homeric swordsmen? What was the creaking charge of chariots, beside this swift rush, this crash, this giddy triumph, this headlong swoop to death? And then athwart this whirling rush of aerial duels, that swooped and locked and dropped in the void between the lamplights and the stars, came a great wind and a crash louder than thunder, and first one and then a score of lengthening fiery serpents plunged hungrily down upon the Dutchman's dikes and struck between land and sea, and flared up again in enormous columns of glare and crimson smoke and steam. And out of the darkness leapt the little land, with its spires and trees, aghast with terror, still and distinct, and the sea, tumbled with anger, red foaming like a sea of blood. Over the populous country below went a strange multitudinous crying and flurry of alarm bells. The surviving aeroplanes turned about and fled out of the sky, like things that suddenly know themselves to be wicked. Through a dozen thunderously flaming gaps that no water might quench, the waves came roaring in upon the land. "We had cursed our luck," says Barney, "that we could not get to our quarters at Alkmaar that night. There, we were told, were provisions, tobacco, and everything for which we craved. But the main canal from Zaandam and Amsterdam was hopelessly jammed with craft, and we were glad of a chance opening that enabled us to get out of the main column and lie up in a kind of little harbor very much neglected and weed-grown before a deserted house. We broke into this and found some herrings in a barrel, a heap of cheeses, and stone bottles of gin in the cellar, and with this I cheered my starving men. We made fires and toasted the cheese and grilled our herrings. None of us had slept for nearly 40 hours, and I determined to stay in this refuge until dawn, and then if the traffic was still choked, leave the barge and march the rest of the way into Alkmaar. This place we had got into was perhaps 100 yards from the canal, and underneath a little brick bridge we could see the flotilla still, and hear the voices of the soldiers. Presently 5 or 6 other barges came through and lay up in the mere near by us, and with 2 of these, full of men of the Antrim regiment, I shared my find of provisions. In return we got tobacco. A large expanse of water spread to the westward of us, and beyond were a cluster of roofs and 1 or 2 church towers. The barge was rather cramped for so many men, and I let several squads, 30 or 40 perhaps altogether, bivouac on the blank. I did not let them go into the house on account of the furniture, and I left a note of indebtedness for the food we had taken. We were particularly glad of our tobacco and fires, because of the numerous mosquitoes that rose about us. The gate of the house from which we had provisioned ourselves was adorned with the legend, Vrugde big vrede, joy with peace, and it bore every mark of the busy retirement of a comfort-loving proprietor. I went along his garden, which was gay and delightful with big bushes of rose and sweetbrier, to a quaint little summer-house, and there I sat and watched the men in groups cooking and squatting along the bank. The sun was setting in a nearly cloudless sky. For the last 2 weeks I had been a wholly occupied man, intent only upon obeying the orders that came down to me. All through this time I had been working to the very limit of my mental and physical faculties, and my only moments of rest had been devoted to snatches of sleep. Now came this rare, unexpected interlude, and I could look detachedly upon what I was doing, and feel something of its infinite wonderfulness. I was irradiated with affection for the men of my company, and with admiration at their cheerful acquiescence in the subordination and needs of our positions. I watched their proceedings and heard their pleasant voices. How willing those men were! How ready to accept leadership and forget themselves in collective ends! I thought how manfully they had gone through all the strains and toil of the last 2 weeks, how they had toughened and shaken down to comradeship together, and how much sweetness there is, after all, in our foolish human blood. For they were just one casual sample of the species. Their patience and readiness lay, as the energy of the atom had lain, still waiting to be properly utilized. Again it came to me with overpowering force that the supreme need of our race is leading, that the supreme task is to discover leading, to forget oneself in realizing the collective purpose of the race. Once more I saw life plain. Very characteristic is that of the rather too corpulent young officer who was afterwards to set it all down in the Wanderjahr. Very characteristic, too, it is of the change in men's hearts that was even then preparing a new phase of human history. He goes on to write of the escape from individuality in science and service, and of his discovery of this salvation. All that was then, no doubt, very moving and original. Now it seems only the most obvious commonplace of human life. The glow of the sunset faded, the twilight deepened into night. The fires burnt the brighter, and some Irishmen away across the mere started singing, but Barnet's men were too weary for that sort of thing, and soon the bank and the barge were heaped with sleeping forms. I alone seemed unable to sleep. I suppose I was